Hello, wonderful people. Byron here again. This is part 7 of our gay Bible talk, LGBTQ plus in general, intersection talk with the scriptures, and kind of Christian history and tradition as well. Again, I literally am talking off the top of my head. I have not prepared any particular thing. Like, I'm remembering all of these verses as I go along, right? Some people have like, Byron, this is all you ever talk about. Number one, no, it isn't. I have a degree in ocean science and theater, and I've been in a bunch of different countries, and I'm a musician. Like, I love talking about all sorts of different things. And I love Avatar: The Last Airbender and Lord of the Rings. And my family. Okay, but like, I was making a comment about like how much people are talking about COVID-19. Like, now that something finally like threatens the general culture and like majority people comfortable population, like it's all people are talking about, and it's really annoying. I get it. This is why I talk about queer stuff all the time, because it's kind of like this Galadriel line to Frodo: "If you don't, no one will." And it like this non-affirming theology is an existential threat to LGBTQ plus people, and in essence, the church. So anyway, this is why I'm kind of talking about it. Another important thing is one of my big themes I hope to communicate is that the Bible is not homophobic. God, we know is not. I hope that we know that. But like in the same way that the Bible is not, well, it's complicated because the Bible says some things that are like weird and not okay about women. Similarly about foreigners. Similarly about slavery. Similarly about like science even, and heliocentricity and stuff. So I have a friend who I used to think that like there was, and maybe I still think this to some extent, that there was this like sneaky way to interpret the Bible that was like revolutionarily feminist or like secretly queer, like rebelliously queer or something. And I don't necessarily think there is. It's not a queer book. It's not a feminist book. It was written by men. Under the inspiration of God, fully. But also I can be inspired to draw a tree, and that doesn't mean that tree is gonna be perfect. It's gonna come from me, and that's a good thing, right? God chose the people to say the things. There's a reason that the Psalms look the way they do, and why Ecclesiastes looks the way it does, and why the Gospels themselves are different, right? We don't just want some fly on the wall narrative, even if such a thing were possible. There's this fun thing called a gospel harmony, where people try to, and for a long time, I always thought that that would be the ideal, like this objective view of what Jesus is. Gospel harmony is when you try to make the 4 gospels into one book. Like if something repeats, then cut it out. If something is like different, then like somehow synthesize them, which I think that's an abuse of the text. But yeah, I'm just trying to show that the Bible's not homophobic. I think that it's important, in fact, as a form of like divine co-creation. God made us co-creators with God's self. As a form of divine co-creation, like we're supposed to interpret this stuff. Like Jesus in the New Testament, which is where Jesus shows up. Jesus says, "Have you not read? I desire mercy, not sacrifice." Go learn what that means, Or like Jesus asks, like, what does it mean to you when this verse pops up? The Jews were all about interpreting texts and interpreting them differently. There are interpretations, as I've said, of like Abraham that like praise and refute him at the same time. Like the interpretation is part of it. So anyway, that's a good thing. So I think, queer theology or liberation theology or womanist theology, like these things are super important for understanding the Bible and approaching it. Like screw this hegemony of this like systematic one doctrine theology. Like look at the multifacets of the gem, look at the different parts of the body and stuff. Okay, so we're going to be talking about the intertextual stuff now. I've brought up, I think, everything that I can think of about. I've brought up everything I can think of about what the Bible like says specifically about anything that could be kind of extrapolated as queer stuff. Like there's maybe other. I didn't talk about David and Jonathan. I didn't talk about Ruth and Naomi. Like, are they queer? Maybe there's stuff that's queer-ish about those stories, right? The depth of the expression of love between Ruth and Naomi, like yeah, and we get into like weird incest things, which is why it's not like the best example of like sexual ethics or relational ethics or something like that. But neither is like King Solomon, the like the paradigm, yeah, paragon of like sexual ethics himself. Neither is David. Truly, like no one in the Bible follows this like one man, one woman, procreative couple narrative. Except Adam and Eve, and they don't count because they were created for each other. And even then, there's like these funky, way apocryphal stories of like Lilith as like Adam's first wife. But I could digress. I'm not going there. Maybe Isaac. And his wife Rachel. What's her name? I think they, but I don't think that says anything about, like concubines or other wives or anything. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen. And that's not a great argument. I'm not saying it, it did happen because it doesn't say it. That's an argument from the negative. Right, Amos marries a prostitute. Isaiah, I think, and I don't remember exactly how, but like Isaiah monogamously, heterosexually, procreatively marries a woman, I think. Mary and Joseph don't even count. They had a baby out of wedlock. Like, even Elizabeth and Zechariah don't really count. Like God had to intervene to give them a baby, right? So they're not a typically procreative couple, right? Like this ideal, and just because no one actually like fits the ideal doesn't mean that like it's not God's best or ideal. It's just just an important comment to note. Nadia Bolz-Weber has this idea of like you can sow a field, like a square plot of land, and those like rotating one of the more efficient, or at least the easiest way to water a crop is with this center point irrigation system, which is just like a pipe that goes around. The issue is on a square plot with a round thing, you miss the edges. And part of the idea of like the way sexual ethics has been communicated through the Bible, but like more like filtered through this stupid Victorian ethics and like stupid purity culture and stuff. Like the plot of land of humanity is this big, and the little circle that's being watered or validated, these never divorced, cisgender, heterosexual, happily married, have great sex, have male children, right? Like the sexual ethics supposedly that the Bible communicates, that we think the Bible communicates, so bogus. Jesus spends so much of his time like outside of that circle, and he's not saying necessarily like, oh, like all of that is good, or like he's not saying definitively like you're wrong, this is what I created and good, but like Also, don't call anything I created unclean. So, I mean, not saying that like God created divorce or something, but in fact, so we're going to talk about. I, as a person, am not well versed in. My parents have always been together in divorce. I'm not well versed. I don't have many friends who. I have some friends who have parents who are divorced. Just my exposure to that is very limited, and so in essence, my like just understanding of it, even theologically, is somewhat limited. Um, I had kind of a major mind blown thing this last summer when I played a divorced dad as a character in a play. And I talked with my director, whose parents had divorced, and I had been always kind of very judgy of that. Not in practice, I don't think, although that stuff tends to leak out even if you don't mean it to. But just in theory, like I held this hierarchy, this priority of like, oh, this is ideal and that's just broken. And I think if someone divorces, probably it's a good thing. At this, at this point in lives and cultures and stuff. Because the alternative is a lot of strife. And I think that to me doesn't decrease the sanctity of marriage or marriage vows or something. It just takes a lot of consideration. I've dated some people who I certainly wouldn't marry. Anyway, so we are actually going to enter into this kind of question of divorce because we're gonna talk Matthew chapter 19. So people say again, I kind of left this out of the last. Oh, I was also gonna my mind. So David and Jonathan, like, not saying they're queer, but what they were doing was, by some understandings, a little queer. Ruth and Naomi, it's a little queer. Even the Noah story, like, there's stuff about that could be interpreted as queer. Obviously the eunuchs, obviously like gender non-conforming characters. Some interpretations of like what does it mean for John to have been the disciple who Jesus loved? I mentioned kind of very briefly in the last video Joseph of Arimathea, Lazarus, or even the Roman centurion and his servant. Like, again, these are not I didn't have particularly great role models of queer existence and love and stuff when I was growing up. And I'm not saying these people are like great role models, right? Like, if the Roman centurion and the word for like and his boy like could mean his like his sex slave boy. And again, maybe they love each other, but like the power dynamics there are weird. And not something that we're wanting to emulate. Thank you, Matthew Vines, for pointing this stuff out. But I also don't want to fall into this trap of like the good gays and the bad gays, like the culture that's out there that like does all of these things. There's stereotypes about like promiscuity and all sorts of things, and it's a stereotype. It's not helpful. It's not really true. And there's also like history behind expressions of any of that too. Yeah, queer characters. I mean, Priscilla was a boss. Doesn't mean she was queer. She was obviously married to Aquila. But that was a matriarchal kind of scenario in what is typically a patriarchal society. Now, in Rome, women were allowed to own like property and own businesses and things, so that's cool. Right, this stuff is intersected. Right, feminism is crucial to queer theory. Racial equity and social justice and the civil rights movement is the foundation of women's rights and queer rights. Now it's interesting, I think, in my opinion, that like that's where it started, is civil rights, racial rights, and kind of what stemmed from that is feminism and then queer stuff, and then the order in which we've addressed or like gotten those things taken care of seems somewhat in reverse, at least in terms of like societal superficial level, that like we have a lot of queer rights now. Women have like all the rights. Now there's still issues of like pay and huge amounts of misogyny and things, and equal representation. But like, and actually, I think gender is the most foundational form of discrimination from the beginning. Right, Adam and Eve are expressed as like in some form of opposition to each other. Anyway, maybe that's just a personal tangent. So we're going to talk Matthew 19. I'm in 13. Yeah, people say like, oh, Jesus didn't talk about gay stuff. And like, yeah, he kind of didn't, but then he kind of did. Like, what does he say about marriage? Okay, and then Jesus is asked a question about divorce and says a thing about marriage, which is a rational, like, logical thing. But like, it's very logical fallacy, sort of, to like take this as if he were answering a question about, Jesus, can you define marriage for us and tell us if gay things are okay? Which is how people use this. They say like, oh, Jesus talked about man and woman. Yeah, sure, when he was answering a question about divorce that was inherent, from people who understood marriage as between men and women. Like, again, messianic secret. If Jesus was gonna, what hill was Jesus gonna die on? They would have stoned him right there if he had, or like he would have lost all his followers or whatever if he had tried to instill like queer justice, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. Okay, so Jesus had now finished what he wanted to say, and he left Galilee and came into the part of Judea which is on the far side of the Jordan. Large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. Some Pharisees approached him to test him. Like, it wasn't an honest question, it was specifically a test already. And they said, is it against the law for a man to divorce his wife on any pretext whatever? Objection, Your Honor, leading question. Right, like, he answered, have you not read? The Creator from the beginning made them male and female. And he said, and we'll get into Genesis, because what he's doing is quoting Genesis right here. So, have you not read, from the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and that he said, this is why a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and the two become one flesh. They are no longer two, therefore, but one body. So then, what God has united, man must not divide. And some people stop there. Most people stop there, but it continues. They said to him, why then did Moses command... No, I'm going to stop here. I'm going to point out, Jesus quotes both Genesis narratives there. He quotes Genesis 1:27 and also 2:24. He says, God made them male and female. That's Genesis 1. Male and female. Right. I mean, that story also kind of has this like hierarchical narrative that has been used in ancient cultures and today still as this idea of like men first, women second, which I think is bogus. Man made the male and female, and what that's saying is in fact that they are equal, and and if he just wanted to say that, he wouldn't have had to say this second part. That is why, therefore, a man must leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, and the two become one flesh. So this second narrative is they are equal, therefore marriage is holy. Therefore, a man leaving his father and mother is a new prioritization above the nuclear family understanding. And the two become one flesh. Therefore, people can't separate that. Why? Because of the equality there. The issue that so then the Pharisees, disgruntled, say, and Jesus says, like, by no means, no reasons for divorce, ever. And then he accommodates and points out other forms of accommodation. So they said to him, this is now verse 7, then why did Moses command that a writ of dismissal should be given in cases of divorce? That's from Deuteronomy 24:1. It was because you were so unteachable, thick-headed. he said, hard-hearted, that Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but it was not like this from the beginning. Now I say to you, the man who divorces his wife, I'm not speaking of fornication, adultery, and marries another, is guilty of adultery. So Jesus says, like, none of it. And then when pressed, he says, like, okay, also adultery. Now, frankly, I think if pressed, Jesus would also say, and also in cases of abuse or neglect. Now, I don't want to like go too far down that rabbit hole of like, I don't know, like the type of pain that exists in like an unhappy marriage, but especially like if someone, Bishop Eugene Robertson, or is that's the Message guy? There's an Episcopal bishop who's like the first gay ordained bishop, and he divorced his wife because he was gay. And and I've heard some people like be very critical of that and like, screw you. Like, do you have any grace? Like, please. Jesus makes accommodations. And Jesus is the only one who can validate those accommodations. So I'm not saying like, oh, if you like have an unhappy marriage. In fact, that's why God created the whole, in Muslim cultures, certain like strictness of it, and also in like early Hebrew stuff, you could just say, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, for any reason. If you're unsatisfied with the sex, or if you find that like she's not a virgin or whatever. Not to speak anything of like your own virginity, which is unprovable. The entire concept of virginity is a stupid power weapon against women, and it has been weaponized against men as well. So, so why did Moses then command a writ of dismissal? Because God was trying to create a way of protecting women. Like the whole levirate marriage thing, like the whole like don't have sex with people who are vulnerable type of thing, or can't consent. And Jesus, Moses, God, everyone accommodates, right? It's not okay to just like lay down some unapproachable law. Like Jesus intensifies the law, but the point of that is not saying like, be perfect, therefore, as my Father in heaven is perfect. Not because you can do it, but because it truly reveals the depth of your need for Jesus and reconciliation and grace. If you're guilty of breaking one part of the law, you're guilty of breaking the whole law. No one is perfect, not even one. So from the beginning, and that says some interesting things about the fall and the intent of creation and things, and we'll get into that in a second. But the whole point here is that Jesus is answering a question about divorce, and by doing so, he is elevating or like reminding people of the already elevated equal status of women. That you can't just treat them like garbage and throw them away. Like, marriage is a serious covenant. That's why God uses marriage metaphors and adultery metaphors and all sorts of things for Israel's relationship with God. And that extends all the way to Revelation, which we'll talk about at the end. So it's really just like, objection, Your Honor, like logical fallacy to use this verse way hecka out of context to try to like disprove the validity of gay marriage. Especially if you continue on from this point. Verse 10. The disciples said to him, "Oh, if that's the way things are between a husband and wife, it's better not to marry." Like, if I can't just chuck this woman out the door because she's not, doing what I tell her, then it's better to not marry. But he replied, "It's not for everyone who can accept what I have said, but only those to whom it is granted." That sounds to me like a calling. There are eunuchs born... Okay, like, what? Now we're, like, way out of the blue. Or are we? Sorry. So, there are eunuchs born that way from their mother's womb. There are eunuchs made so by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves that way for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone who can accept this, do so. Now, some people use this argument of, like, celibacy is, like, a form of being a eunuch. And like yes and no. Like as I said, eunuchs were sometimes seen as like sex slaves. So like abstinence and celibacy like are kind of not major considerations there. But people who are born that way from their mother's womb, that sounds like God is acknowledging that there are people who are born, and the sound, eunuch, in as much as being a eunuch is also at times a physical thing. I think Jesus is describing the three types of eunuchs, that there are people who are born intersex or with sexual different appearances. They're SDAs or something, attributes or whatever. There's a better term for it than just blanket intersex. But like, I mean, the old word would be like hermaphrodites. People born or with ambiguous genitalia or reproductive organs or something, who are usually at that point like infertile, but not always. So people who are born that way, that sounds like Psalm 139, pretty validating of God knowing that there are these people out there. People who are made so by others, that sounds like the castration one. And then people who make themselves that way for the kingdom of heaven. Now, that's interesting because there was kind of a tradition later. There was this kind of ascetic celibacy, incel bro kind of thing that happened in the 2nd century-ish and 3rd century-ish, and even like late 1st century, that Paul and some other people had to like clamp down on, because it was related to like Gnosticism and this like, oh, the flesh is bad type of thing. And obviously the flesh can't be bad because Jesus came in the flesh. So people who make themselves that way for the kingdom of heaven. He's probably not talking about people who castrate themselves. In this case, he may be talking, because I don't think God would be down with that. And I don't think God would just say like, hey, accept that if that happens. Although also, like, accept that if that happens. What's the point of like berating someone after they've cut their genitals off? Like, that doesn't help anyone. I think it's probably more of a behavioral thing, and these are people who are like called to celibacy, which happens to be people like Jesus. Let anyone who can accept this do so. What? Wow. Because you were so hard-hearted, God accommodated to your narrow understanding of marriage, and now God is saying like, hey, by the way, it's bigger than that too. Like, let anyone accept this who can. No, again, I'll fully say, like, this doesn't single-handedly like validate gay marriage, but if we're understanding eunuchs as like the Bible's first step in that process, because like Rosa Parks was not about to go like become a CEO right after she like sat at the front of the bus, right? Like, there's increments here, and like, what kind of increments are we gonna get to in the future? Who knows? But the Holy Spirit is with us through all of it. Okay, so that's Matthew 19. I think it's also Mark 10 that like mentions the same story, but Matthew 19 is more full. It is fun. Okay, so that's one of the intertextual verses that, why is every representation of marriage in the Bible generally like heteronormative? Why was every president before Barack Obama white? Right? It just couldn't happen. Right? And then it does. And let anyone accept that who can. Okay, so now this is maybe one of the most complex parts, and I hope I can do it justice. But we're gonna jump way back to like Genesis 1, because that's what Jesus was referencing. Oh boy, this one's just like so. This is like, I've only used half an hour of this video so far, so I still have 45 minutes, I think, to talk about this, or more. Like, these videos can go over an hour 15. They just have tended to be an hour and 15. Okay. We're going to start with the creation narrative. We may get into some fall theology. It's so esoteric, like unapproachable and like theoretical that it's really hard to, and so disagreeable, right? Like some people are gonna like hate me in this video and like write me off just because I don't believe in a 6-day creation. I'm sorry, I don't. Largely because I think God gave us rational minds, and part of that led to science, and science has, you know, and if we, try to say that the Bible is a scientific document, then we expose the Bible to being scientifically disproven. And I just don't think it is. Like, if there's some disagreement, then the issue is not the two, like, foundational ways of knowing, spiritual and physical. It's something in our interpretation of either one. Creation, right? Why should anything in creation tell us anything that, like, disproves God? It won't. So actually, I think that this is the way to most authentically approach the text in terms of genre, in terms of what was intended by the writer, if not intended by God. There's early, is it Origen? There's the theologian writer person. There's like early Christian writers, first century, second, third century people who are like, of course the Old Testament's not literal, right? Like, just in terms of genre, if you're looking at a car manual, you're not expecting it to be poetry. If you're reading like a play, you're not expecting it to be literal or history or something. The Bible has all these different genres. It is not a book, it is a library. And an incomplete one at that, right? This has, 7 more books or so than a normal Bible because it's a Catholic Bible. The Ethiopian Orthodox Bible has like 16 more books. Are they supposed to be there? I don't know. I've already said I think the Didache should be in the canonical Protestant Bible. So anyway, yeah. So Genesis. Here we go. I guess I'll just read or summarize the first like couple chapters of the Bible, because why not? It's good to read the Bible. In the beginning, not at the beginning, during the beginning, while God was going about creation, the UCC Church has United Church of Christ has this phrase: "Don't place a period where God has placed a comma. God is still speaking." Right? When Jesus like makes new eyes for this dude out of mud, like that is in the nothing that was created was made without him. This is the very creative spirit of God going about it. It says that God rested, and does that mean he was done or God was done? Like, whatever. So in the beginning, God the Word, Logos, created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was a formless void, tohu abohu, where there was darkness over the deep. Also, a fun thought, like, this isn't like an empty void, it's a full void. And what does that mean? We have this idea ex nihilo, God creates out of nothing. But it's like, was it out of nothing? Because there was tohu bohu. There was darkness over the deep. The deep of what? And God hovered over the waters. The waters? There's waters? Did God create the waters? Right? I'm just saying, like, let's question stuff. God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God divided the light from the dark, called the light day and the darkness night. Evening came and morning came, the first day. God said, "Let there be a vault in the waters to divide the waters in two," and so it was. And God made the vault, and it divided the waters above and the vault from the waters below. Wow, it's windy outside. God called the vault heaven. Evening came and morning came, the second day. Heaven, sky, right? God created the heavens and the earth. Does that mean like created the pearly gates and the mountain of whatever? Just the words, right? The words that we are used to reading in English. Like, what is our interpretation? This is already proposing like that there is water above the atmosphere, and that like we already have a flat earth idea with a dome, like, just saying, it's poetical. Like, you want to believe a literal Bible and 6-day creation, you got to believe a whole lot more and like disbelieve a whole lot more about science and like all these things. But these aren't like literal. These aren't literal words. In fact, these narratives are similar and in very specific ways different from other like Mesopotamian myths and other creation narratives, largely because of the relationality of God and because of the singleness of God. Like, God is one. Okay, second day. God said, "Let the waters under the heaven come together into a single mass, and let dry land appear." As if that land was always under the water. Did God create it or just reveal it? Who knows? Just asking questions. So it was. God called the dry land earth, and the mass of waters seas. And God saw that it was good. God said, "Let the earth produce vegetation," without the sun, seed-bearing plants and fruits, trees bearing fruits with their seed inside the earth, and so it was. The earth produced vegetation, plant-bearing seeds in their several kinds, and trees bearing fruit with their seed inside with several kinds. God saw that it was good. Evening came, morning came, the third day. God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them indicate festivals, days, years. Let them be, and potentially, never mind. Only so many controversial things at a time. Days, years, festivals. Let them be lights in the vaults of heaven to shine on the earth." And so it was. God made the two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the smaller light to govern the night, and the stars. God set them in the vault of heaven to shine on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. God saw that it was good. Evening came, morning came, the fourth day. God said, "Let the waters teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth with the vault of heaven." And so it was. God created the great sea serpents of every kind of living creature. It was with which the waters teem, and every kind of winged creature. God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters of the seas. Let the birds multiply upon the earth." Evening came, morning came, the fifth day. God said, "Let the earth produce every kind of living creature, cattle, reptiles, every kind of wild beast." And it was. God made every kind of wild beast, every kind of cattle, and every kind of land reptile. God saw that it was very good. God said, "Let us make man in our own image, in the likeness of ourselves, and let them be masters of the fish of the sea, the birds of heaven, the cattle, all the wild beasts, and all the reptiles that crawl upon the earth." God created man in the image of himself, and in the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. So in the first narrative, male and female were created at the same time. My legs are getting tired just sitting here talking so long. Okay, God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply." That's the first commandments. Fill the earth and conquer it. Okay, conquer is not as imperialist of a term as we've interpreted it to be. Be masters of the fish of the sea and birds of heaven and all animals on the earth. God said, "See all the plants, all the seed-bearing fruit and stuff. This shall be your food. To all the wild beasts and birds of heaven and all the wild reptiles on the earth, I give all the foliage of plants for food." And so it was. God saw all that he had made, and it was indeed very good. Evening came and morning came, the sixth day. Okay. Thanks be to God. So, sorry, I know I speak fast. It's just as if that was the worst part of this video. So there's a guy named Asher O'Callahan who's a trans pastor in, I think, Colorado. I don't know if he came up with this, but he told me about it. And not personally, I don't know him personally, unfortunately. Maybe I will one day. He talked about this narrative, this creation narrative. He said, so God created the sun and the moon, but we don't understand those to be like these exhaustive binaries. It's not like noon, midnight, noon, midnight. There's like sunsets and sunrises and 3:00 in the afternoon tea, and eclipses, and then also like stars and comets and things. Like, of course it's not this binary thing. It says God created land and sea. Well, is that really the only thing? No, of course those things interact, and they have this in between. You know, I'm an oceanographer. I study river systems and like swamps and rain and this stuff that like exists in between these two binaries. Um, it says God created fish and birds. Well, tell me what a penguin is, right? Like, what's a flying fish? These puffins, you know, all of these things that kind of like break the mold. You know, we are the platypuses. We are the penguins. Um, there's an architectural term called a squinch, a squinch, and that is when you put a round dome on top of a square base, right? And the squinch is the cool pieces that like make those come together. Um, so, I mean, one interpretation is that God literally did just make like male and female, and that's it. But also, like, as we've just been talking, if God made all of these things and we understand them to be not binaries, why would we fathom this idea that God made, you know, God only made, according to the Bible hymn, myth, poem, creation narrative, God made two people. Now, that's questionable because then as soon as later Cain killed Abel and went off and found a whole other group of people. He was worried about being murdered by whom? God had only made Adam and Eve and those kids, right? Well, no. It's just, you know, why God is working elsewhere as well. Why should this be, you know, either God was working elsewhere or um um well, yeah, whatever. Okay, so like transgender, queer, like, yeah, some people say that like, oh, like from the beginning God made them male and female. And you know, yeah, we started off with two people hypothetically. But they weren't even necessarily straight. Like, what if both of them were bi? They was just the only other person around. You know, and then once you're married, you commit to marriage and stuff. That's not a huge shocker. You know, so I could kind of go either way. I'm not the hugest fan of the idea of like God created male and female, and then at the fall everything got like shattered and broken, and God had to like. But even then, like if God like intentionally created me and other queer stuff and like all these squinches, in a beautiful like restorative effort to continue to provide for humanity and like save us, I'm fine with that. You know, I used to believe that for a long time. I still kind of do to some extent. But that's getting into fall theology. I'll come back to that, I think. Either way, in this narrative, God makes male and female at the same time, and by no means does that have to be a binary, except for like procreative reasons from the beginning. Be fruitful and multiply. Let's talk about that for a little while. My mom has this narrative. She says, if I, as your parent, tell you to go do the dishes, you got to go do the dishes. Be fruitful and multiply, God says. So go do that. Now, biologically, by God's wisdom, heterosexuality and just sex in general is this beautiful procreative thing that is great for genetic diversity, great for pleasure. I mean, all sorts of things. So I'm in no way dissing heterosexuality, or the obvious logic of like the fit and the beauty of that. Doesn't always work. Like, it's not this perfect ideal. You know, you can still have sex and like someone's infertile or something. Sorry, so many thoughts. Be fruitful and multiply. But at some point, if my mom tells me to do the dishes, at some point the dishes are done. Like, at some point I have accomplished the task. And I think, you know, global population and whatnot, like, we have accomplished the task of being fruitful and multiplying. Enough of that. It's not our job to continue to, like, wash clean plates. It's not our job to, you know, I've heard some people jokingly say that, like, gay people are God's answer to overpopulation. Which, the narrative of overpopulation is kind of one that's based in racism in some ways, and imperialist. We have enough resources to actually care for people if we lived ethically. Overpopulation is not the issue. Resource management is. And that gets back to this like big thing. Care for the earth. Be stewards of the earth. It's not, subdue and conquer. So I think that's everything relevant to Genesis 1. We'll get into the fall in a bit. I'm going to continue with Genesis 2. God's image. God says, "Let us." Then God created man God said, "Let us make man in our image." Is God male? Is God female? So what image is that? Now Jesus is male, and this gets into like a fun theoretical question. Jesus as co-eternal with the Father as God, does Jesus sitting now in heaven post resurrection, whatever that means? God is eternal outside of time, age to age. Does that mean Jesus has the same like freckles that he had when he was, chilling with Peter by the lake? Maybe not. Like, our resurrected bodies definitely look different. They are connected, they're related to us, but like, people had a hard time recognizing Jesus and stuff. But he still had scars and stuff. So maybe God was sitting there like and looked over at Jesus and was like, "I'm gonna make them look like you, like the left fingers and stuff." And they'll be like hairy, whatever. Like, is that what that means, that we're made in God's image, like that we have fingers? No, it means that we're relational. Specifically what the Bible indicates is that we will rule. What the Bible indicates by us being made in God's image is our capacity to rule, to have authority, spiritual authority over creation. And we have abused that, and that is one of the most grievous things that we have done as a species, as God's creations. But also, personally, what I think it means to be created in God's image is to be relational. Although, like, dogs and orcas and things are relational. Robots are relational, or they are programmed to be. So maybe that's not really it. Yeah. I don't know. Having a complex enough soul or something? Like, I don't know what it made in God's image is. So what I do think it is our capacity to create. So creativity. We are co-creators with God. And our authority. So those two main things. I also think there's something about relationality in there, but that may not be inherent. And the Bible doesn't seem to like indicate that as part of what it means to be made imago Dei. Okay, so 2. Thus, heaven and earth were completed in all their array. On the 7th day, God completed the work he had been doing. He rested on the 7th day after blah, 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 and made it was holy because of all the work. Such were the origins of the earth. Take 2. Different story. Why? At the time when Yahweh made the earth and heaven, at the time, because there's other stuff out there. Aliens? No, I don't know. There was as yet no wild bush on the earth. Okay. Nor any wild plant had yet sprung up, for Yahweh God had not sent rain to the earth, nor was there any man to till the soil. However, a flood was rising. Now, does that necessarily disagree with, like, scientific, like, deep time origins of the earth with, like, accretion and then the Hadean Eon with, lava, and then everything solidifies and there's no, like, plants or life or anything yet? But it's a processional thing. People say, like, a day is like 1,000 years to God. Well, why should 1,000 years be 1,000 years to God? Why not, have this be some big allegory of like extended creation? Not that it's even necessary to synthesize those two, but why not? It's beautiful. Okay, no people. However, a flood was rising from the earth and watering all the surface of the soil. Yahweh God fashioned man of dust from the soil then breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and thus man became a living being. Yahweh God planted a garden in Eden, which is to the east, where he put the man he had fashioned. Yahweh God caused to spring up from the soil every kind of tree enticing to look at and good to eat, with the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the middle of the garden. A river flowed from Eden to water the garden, from where it divided to make 4 streams. The first is named Pishon, and it encircles the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. The gold of this land is pure bdellium and onyx stone. Is pure. Bdellium and onyx stone can be found there. The second river is named Gihon, and it encircles the whole land of Cush. That's like Ethiopia-ish. The third river is named the Tigris and flows to the east of Ashur, and the fourth river is the Euphrates. So, like, this is already explaining topographical, geographical kind of places. Like, what? Before, like, creation? Gold? Anyway, whatever. It's just like, these stories are weird, and that's totally fine. We don't need to express them, with such fear and rigidity. Like, that only drives people away. Yahweh God took the man and settled him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate and take care of it. We are gardeners. God is a gardener. Then Yahweh God gave the man this admonition: you may eat indeed of all the trees of the garden, nevertheless of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you are not to eat. For on that day you eat it, you shall most surely die. Okay. Yahweh God said, it is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helpmate. And by the way, that's the same word used for the Holy Spirit. It's not this, like, subservient helper. It's this, like, helpful partner helper. So from the soil, Yahweh God fashioned all the wild beasts and all the birds of heaven. These he brought to the man to see what he would call them. Each one was to bear the name the man would give it. The man gave names to all the cattle, all the birds of heaven, and all the wild beasts, but no helpmate suitable for the man was found for him. So, Yahweh God made the man fall into a deep sleep, and while he slept, he took one of the ribs and enclosed it in flesh. Yahweh God built the rib he had taken from the man into a woman, and brought her to the man. The man exclaimed, at last, this is bone from my bones and flesh from my flesh. This is to be called woman, for this was taken from man. This is why a man leaves his father and joins himself to his wife, and they become one body. Now both of them were naked, and the man and his wife, they felt no shame in front of each other. So that phrase is used by some people to be like, aha, see, heterosexuality, heteronormativity. And that's, we'll kind of pause here. We can talk about the fall maybe in a bit. It's not the most important thing, because it's still, it falls into this rhetorical trap of, like, where did queerness come from? And frankly, it doesn't matter. It is now, so we got to figure it out. And okay, one of my general feelings about the Garden of Eden, a lot of Protestants particularly talk about the Garden of Eden as if it's this perfect thing, and that it is the end goal. It is not the end goal. It is our infancy. Babies are great. I love babies. But we're meant to grow up from that. Right? Like, Paul talks about spiritual milk and then spiritual food, like meat or whatever, that we're meant to grow up. Again, my mom is a midwife. I've learned so much from her. Like, breast milk, human breast milk, is the perfect thing for human babies. So, like, I'm not saying the Garden of Eden wasn't perfect. It was perfect. And we are meant to grow up from that into heaven, the kingdom of heaven, our own eschatological end. Or not even end, just like culmination. So that's one of my, like, major philosophical, theological ideas, is that the whole point of this is the idea of growth, that we grow into and we grow up from. and we learn, and that's progressional. So part of the progression is complexity. You shine white light through a prism and you realize that it's more than you thought it was. You do a scientific test and you get data and you have to make new theories to understand this stuff. So complementarity is really what most people argue when it comes to queer stuff. It's look, God made male and female. That's it. Well, number one, that's not it. Okay, whether through whether God created queer stuff immediately just because of the diversity of creation that Jesus acknowledged, either way, eventually at some point, post-fall, pre-fall, doesn't matter, although it's fun to think about, there are queer people now. There is, queer identity, and God knows about it, and God validates it. And is at very least very good at loving and interacting with all of the beauty that it is. Complementarity is kind of a thing, right? Biological procreative complementarity is, the ability for our biology to make a baby because male and female, penis, vagina, sperm, egg. That exists. That's real. And that's good. It's just, that's not everything that exists, right? We go to objective nature. And if you want to argue this is a result of the fall, fine. Again, I don't care. It doesn't matter. It's the world we live in now. God says no one technically eats meat until after Noah, I think, right? They sacrifice animals, but I don't think they eat them. It says Cain and Abel, Abel was raising animals and stuff. And I don't, that's an interesting comment. But if you want to be a real stickler for the fall, right? A virus can only exist as a parasitic pathogen, right? Fungi are dependent upon the idea of death. So if we have this pre-fall perfect world idea that there was no death, and does that, and animals just ate plants, what did lions do? Their biology is built for carnivore, eating meat. Does that mean once the fall happened, half of the animal kingdom and eukaryotes and protists and all of these things fundamentally changed in nature? Well, that's a creative thing. That's evidence for this God is still speaking thing too. And God, maybe it was an accommodation, that's fine. Maybe it so just if we have to rest so strictly and fearfully on ideas of what creation is, the Bible never necessitates us to do with it what many people have, which is to take it literally and abuse the text in that way. And I'm sorry if that's a huge threat to the way that you have been brought up, maybe even for decades. There's no, right? The only thing holding people back from learning new stuff is pride. And that's a hard thing to accept. But, right, if we were wrong, take it to Jesus. Take it to the Lord in prayer. Right? If we're afraid of losing something, then we are holding it as an idol above God. And if we are afraid of something being a threat to God or our own faith, that's a lack of faith, which is fine too. God help my unbelief, right? I know I'm saying really disruptive things to certain forms of systematic theology, and kind of that privilege of the conservative thing. A person who only sees in black and white is telling a person who sees in color, no, that color doesn't exist, right? This person is saying to this person, you're wrong. This person, however, saying, I see in color. I can see clearly now the rain is gone. This person is saying to this person who sees in black and white, you're right. Black and white exist out there. And it's more than that. Right? What's the fear? The fear is like diluting God somehow. Right? And I get it. Like, that's actually, people do that. People like dilute God into this, like, oh, it's just like whatever you feel, man. Like whatever's good for you. He's like, no, I think, my grandma wrote this book called Make God Look Big. I love it. Great book. There's more than one way to make a thing big, right? If you got a packet of Kool-Aid and you pour it in a pitcher, technically, if you want more people to have Kool-Aid, you just pour in more water. You dilute it. So technically, everyone has Kool-Aid, but you dilute it, and it's like it's boring. It's bland. It's technically people are getting the like Kool-Aid molecules, but it's not God anymore. It's versus what I think we need to do with God is magnify God. That's a biblical word. Magnify, glorify. So anyway, like I know I'm saying some like hard stuff, and I'm about to go to seminary. Like, isn't it fun that like I'm 24 and these are these ideas that I've come across so far, and I am totally open for all of them to change. I hear people talk so beautifully and compellingly about like 6-day creation, and they believe in it. It's so beautiful to them, and I'm like, that's I don't necessarily have that sense of like awestruck wonder when I think about creation. I have a different form of co-creative like impressive complexity and stuff. So I'm not telling anyone that they're wrong, that their faith is invalid because they believe a particular way. It's not a salvific issue, right? Creation or affirmingness or whatever. It is a faith issue, right? If God doesn't want people to be blind. Those that have ears to hear, do hear. If you don't have ears, pray to God for ears, I guess. God did the whole like healing the servant who Peter cut his ear off thing. Like I hope this doesn't come across as like condescending or anything. I understand if it does, for which I am sincerely apologetic. I try to. What I try to do is just try to show how beautiful all of this is, because I think it is truly beautiful. Okay, so complementarity. There's a couple different types of complementarity, and most of them are garbage, or not biblical. So, sitting up again for a second. There is biological complementarity. Like that one's pretty easy to wrap our heads around. As I said, like male, female, sperm, egg, penis, vagina, like these are important, beautiful things. And the Bible doesn't talk about biology, right? Again, just like as a non-scientific book, the Bible is not like here to talk to us about biology. The reasons here for like therefore that is why a man leaves his father and mother and joins himself to his wife and they become one flesh, like that's not a biological imperative, that's a relational imperative. Okay, so if people want to claim like the roots of why homosexuality is bad is because it's not procreative, sorry, like old people who like an old heterosexual couple, that's not procreative. A young heterosexual couple where one of them happens to be infertile, like that's not procreative. Plenty of scenarios don't, a baby who dies, that's like, that's part of the, like, I hesitate to say like part of the brokenness of the world, but it, at the same time, it also kind of is. So particularly Catholic ideas, and frankly, they're not inherent to Catholicism. Other things bring them up as well. I think it's super funny when Protestants bring up these like Catholic ideas and are also like not chill with other Catholic things. But for instance, I think there's ways to trace that, like, the reason in Catholicism that, like, priests can't have, that priests can't be married and have kids, or can't be married, is because they don't want them having kids and passing on lineages and dynasties of bishops and priests and stuff, because that would be bad, for power reasons. So that's like a defensible reason why. And do we need that anymore? Like, anyway, so like biological complementarity. And this gets to like things about contraception. Like, I think contraception is great. Now this gets into questions about like abortion and stuff, and like I have opinions. I have tons of questions. There are so many perspectives, many of which I think are beautiful, so many of which I think are very painful. You know, procreation is only one step away. Procreation is only one step away from this question of contraception, and only one step away from this question of abortion, and frankly, only one step away from this huge like question of eugenics. Like, big stuff, But I heard someone say this video is going to be long. I heard someone say that. Oh, darn it! All of my digressions, they just don't make sense to me if I pause at all. Again, y'all, thanks for your patience. I hope you're finding this as entertaining as I am. Like, I really do enjoy this stuff. Man. Okay, well, whatever. Procreation. Yeah, like, biology just isn't a huge... In the same way that, like, the incest verses, I don't think are inherently about, like, the genetic risk of deformity or congenital defects and things. Like, it's relevant in the same way that, like, not eating pork in the desert is, like, based on off a physical, which is essentially a scientific understanding. But the Bible's moral logic or moral reasoning for talking about man and woman isn't that. Other forms of complementarity in Genesis, we talked about value complementarity or value hierarchy. It's this opposite but equal idea, not with the value one. The value hierarchy complementarity is like men are in charge of women, and that men just have more value. So you can send a woman out to be raped to death by an angry xenophobic mob, but not a man, right? That's not something that the Bible is endorsing or condoning. There's cultural or like behavioral complementarity, right? Like, women are maternal and like gentle, and even the Bible has this malakos word in Greek that means like soft or effeminate. Well, it's making claims, it's making arguments about what women are like. And again, is that normal or normative? Is it even normal, right? Is it like women have to be this way? Is there anything inherent about wearing a dress that is feminine? No. Is there anything inherent about women having long hair that is feminine? No. They're just arbitrary things that some cultures have consistently and some don't have consistently that indicate and mean gender. A lot of that is performed, and I don't mean that in a condescending negative way. I'm a performer. I'm a actor. So yeah, like those ideas of behavioral complementarity, like, they aren't legit or consistent, and the reason they're not legit is because they're not consistent across like humanity or cultures, and so and there's very little in the Bible that says, like, I mean, there's even like a good wife should do all these things, and but again, how much of that is cultural? So much is the answer. Like, there's other forms of complementarity that are relevant, but any of them that are like proposed or introduced in the Bible aren't necessarily, like, most people wouldn't uphold them nowadays. And I'm not trying to appeal to the masses. I'm trying to say, like, let's all just ask a question of whether or not this is still what we're talking about. God kind of seems to endorse some forms of complementarity in some of what God says. Jesus then undermines other bits of that. Paul brings up other forms of like women's roles, men's roles, and the idea with homosexuality is that it is fundamentally like threatening to those things. I remember what I was going to say. Someone said that one of the threats of homosexuality to heterosexuality is that part of this hope, this existential hope of heterosexuality is procreation. This legacy, this eternality that comes from having offspring. And it's kind of selfish and arrogant, actually, in some ways. Not that it's intentionally that way, but like you have kids to, make sure your name is out there. That's kind of an ancient idea, and some of it, like even there's still this cultural idea of like an oldest son to carry on your name. Well, why do men keep their names and women have to give up their names? Like the Bible right here says that is why a man leaves his father and mother, right? So maybe men should give up their names. But you can't. I don't think you can keep like adding on maiden names till someone's name is like Walker Voteman Johnson Childs, to use some names in my own family. Like that cannot be my name. That's just an untenable last name. So, I mean, the idea is that homosexuality is an existential threat to some extent to the ease of heterosexuality, the like intuitive logic of heterosexuality. And I'm sorry we're threatening to you. I don't mean to be. That like if my life can have value outside of the thing that might give your life value, does that invalidate your like value? No, by no means. So one person talked about this like eternality, this procreation thing, and technically, the end of that conversation was because we don't have, I mean, there's adoption and stuff, but because we as queer people often don't have the option for like biological procreation and that type of longevity and legacy, we actually have to give everything that we have to God now. We can't wait for it to happen. And that's quite a calling. What a beautiful and difficult, compelling thing. But yeah, I mean, essentially, in some ways, like homosexuality is seen as a threat to the hegemony and power and privilege of heterosexual power, cisgender power. And there's this like equity, equality narrative. There's this fence post, and there's this tall person, this like medium height person, and this short person who are all wanting to watch a football game. And there's 3 boxes. And equality is technically each person getting a box. But the tall person is taller than the fence and doesn't need the box at all. The medium person needs 1 box to see over the fence. Now they can see the game. And the short person, they can have 1 box, but it's still not enough to see over the fence. What they need is 2 boxes. They need the tall person's box. Right, 1 box each is equality, but that's useless still. It's equity that we need. So equality or even equity feels like subjugation to those who have all the power. And this relates to the third one, which is reality. And the reality is that the medium person, the medium height person, has 1 box. The short person is sitting in a ditch with no boxes, like they're dug even lower. And the rich person has so many boxes that they're like out of the frame. That's the reality of like economic and power-based distribution. And it's, for that person to share their boxes and their power, like, feels like oppression. For a bunch of, white, conservative, middle-class Americans to stay home during this coronavirus thing, feels like oppression. But I'm sorry, it's not, and all suffering, you can't like relate, you can't compare suffering. This phrase that I always like to use. I went to a pretty difficult high school, and oftentimes I would be up until like 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, but there was always someone who stayed up later than me, right? Some of my friends were like, "Oh yeah, of course I stayed up until 3 or 4," and I'm like, "Okay, great. I'm still tired." Right? Like comparing suffering is not the point. It's not this pity party. And frankly, one thing that I'm also like wary about is this victim mentality. That can easily become a problem. Okay, so complementarity, that like homosexuality and transgender things are like a threat to the hegemony of those things. It doesn't need to be. It's only because cishet people are used to having all the power. Um, there was a talk that I saw by an amazing black woman. She was straight cis, but she was talking about the Me Too movement and LGBTQ stuff. And she was her essential thesis was that racism and misogyny and patriarchy actually hurt white men as well, right? It's obvious that those things, that these systems of oppression hurt like queer women of color, but even just like not in malicious ways, just like in default ways, like the fact that band-aids come in this color, right, and not dark colors, like that's systematic racism, and it's wrong to just like put the burden on people of color, like, oh, go make your own band-aids. Like technically I guess people have the capacity to like do that, but um there's this scene in Avatar: The Last Airbender where they pick up Toph. She's the new like earthbender who she's a person who's trying to like help this group of people save the world. And she every time they land, they fly on a giant bison. Wow, if you don't know the story, this sounds ridiculous. They fly, yeah, they fly on a giant bison, and every time they get off to set up camp, she like takes care of herself. She has her own tent. She has collected her own food. She doesn't need a fire, she says. Well, the others, go and collect firewood and set up camp and whatever. And she's like, I'm taking care of myself. I'm carrying my own weight. And the issue is that she's not. This bison is carrying her weight, and she didn't even think about like the system of that. And there's ways in which like a team, a society, like carries each other. A lot of these are digressions, but I think they're super important. At least they're things that like I've learned along this way, and I wouldn't have known them if not for this like marginalized identity. Like I've always lived as some sort of minority in the Middle East. As a baby, I was a baby. Like people don't really respect like children as autonomous adults. And as a child, I was a white person. In both in the Middle East and in Guam, I was a white person in my school and just my society. A privileged white person, like being white and American particularly, carries privilege with it, even in other countries. And then in once I was in Guam, I was also realized that I was queer, and so I like, okay, I'm a sexual minority too. And so when I realized, this is a thing I picked up from an Orthodox friend of mine. He said, when I realized that I was bi, my heart was broken. Because of the loss, the narrative of like, you will never belong. And then my heart was broken open. This level of like empathy and grace and introspection and all of the important things that have like given me God's heart. I'd be a lousy Christian, or I don't think I'd be a lousy Christian. I'd be a more lousy Christian if I wasn't queer. Yeah. So anyway, complementarity. I just think that to base it's also still like very gaslighty, right? Like queer people exist now. What are you going to do about it? Like, are you going to just arbitrarily refer to this like old ideal that is so obviously based in forms of oppression and patriarchy and huge issues. Like, are you gonna relegate, like, compel people who have immediate needs right now? And it's not just like sex, right? It's, you know, the idea of loneliness. We just read Genesis 1, and this idea of it is not good for people to be alone, right? If you're celibate, you probably have some sort of community. Jesus was celibate. He had a ton of people and friends around him. But he was also equipped to expect that. He knew that he was called to that, all of that stuff. Oh, sorry, I was explaining how, like, racism hurts. So it's obvious how racism, like, hurts people of color. But racism and misogyny and patriarchy and all of these things, like, they hurt straight white cis men because it enforces this, like, masculine ideal that no one can live up to. The stress and the rate of suicide of straight white cis men is higher because of these harmful ideals. So we're going to relegate everyone to suffering rather than just get rid of some ideas that don't bear good fruit. If it doesn't bear good fruit, cut it off and throw it in the fire. You know, subject everything to the grace and love of Jesus. And, you know, some people say, like, oh, like, the answer to biblical affirming stuff is just to, like, ignore parts of the Bible, like, because God is love. Well, yes, and it's not, you know, God is so much love that we don't, that in fact, and, you know, it comes with such power that in fact it has the power to rewrite and overwhelm, not just ignore, but, like, push through any amount of negativity or, like, misinterpretation or foolishness. So to base an argument against, and I'm sure there's so much that I'm missing out on. Again, this is, like, pretty theoretical at this point. I don't have, like, texts that I can look up to remind myself, like, oh yeah, I thought that, like, 4 years ago. But that's essentially, like, Genesis. God knew what God created, and called it good. Don't call anything that God created unclean. I guess it's worth transitioning into fall theology now. Well, I guess the last point of Genesis 2 is that they were naked and felt no shame, right? So why do we shame this stuff? Anything. Why do we shame anything? You know, that is the ideal. I think we will be naked in heaven. Oh, no, we won't be naked in heaven. We'll be clothed in righteousness and all of that stuff, right? Development, growth, like, diversification, like, all of these things. You know, oh, yeah, what does it mean for, like, God to have, for there to be prophecies at the end of the Bible where every knee will bow and every tongue will confess? Well, the only reason there's any, like, tongues of any difference is because of the Tower of Babel, right? So this gets into fall theology. So there's this kind of idea that, like, God created this perfect thing and then it broke. Okay, big whoop. As if that threatened God? Like, no, of course it doesn't threaten God. There's this Japanese art form called kintsugi. I studied Japanese for a little while, but I actually only learned about this in, like, a sermon, I think. Or maybe I learned about it in Japanese class, doesn't matter. If a piece of pottery breaks, or sometimes the piece of pottery is broken intentionally, and then you essentially, you solder it back together, or, like, you put all the pieces back together and use gold to hold the cracks. And the point is, at the end, the piece is more beautiful for having been broken. Now, there's still some kind of, like, idealism and, you know, whatever God wanted from the beginning, as Jesus says. Which is important to consider here. But, you know, so I'm fine with that, right? But not everything that came from the fall was evil, and certainly, like, not even bad. Death is one of those things. Language is one of those things. Cooking, culture, you know, these diversification of things that God has essentially more opportunity to show up in. So that's all just really good stuff. So and if we have to depend on God more power to God. That's great. That's a way to make God look big. If I acknowledge that I am broken, which I do, right? I don't believe in original sin. That was a doctrine created by Augustine, like in the year 500. It's not in the Bible. I mean, it is in some ways, but so is predestination, and I don't believe that either. It's just a theological opinion that you have to think about and pray about. Ask God what God thinks about these things. Original sin. I think the original sin is kind of predicated on this idea of brokenness, and of course it is. But it implies weird things about creation and God's capacity to step in. There's this idea called atomists, and it kind of necessitates original sin, by which I mean this you were born into sin, and you are inherently sinful and you can't escape it, and all of those things I kind of agree with. I don't think we are born into sin in as much as we are born into air. Sin is like a gross oil that covers us as soon as we're drowning in it. Of course it gets inside of you and you're digesting it, and it's you are what you eat. So that's my view of sin, but it's not original sin. You are fundamentally created good. And we do live in a broken world, so I'm not arguing against that. But so for instance, if God has prophecies of every tongue will confess, well then that's not a bad thing, right? God made trees in what, the third, fourth day, knowing that God's son would be killed on one. What is that? Back to Psalm 139 about God's omniscience and everything. What does that mean? God knew we would eat the fruit. So what? You think we tricked God? That God couldn't see? And yeah, omniscience and predetermination, those are big theological questions. I think God's big enough to handle all of that, and so should we be. So is something more beautiful for having been broken? Yeah, sure, why not? Maybe if it makes me depend on God more, great. But also queer stuff is and kind of always has been around. Eating meat. This is one of those things. A fun theological idea I came up with a long time ago. Veganism is great. I was vegan for Lent once, or I tried to be. It's hard. I think the points of being vegan, the point should be ethics, environmentalism, these good things that should be found in how we treat animals as part of this creation that we are a part of. Jesus isn't vegan, for better or worse. Jesus could have decided to never eat fish, or maybe we just only knew about that one time that Jesus eats fish on the Sea of Galilee. But if at any point in human civilizations it was necessary for survival, or important for people to eat meat, then eating meat is not sinful. Now abusing an animal for its flesh and then wasting it, that is sinful. So anyway, some of these things that are the result of the fall, it's Genesis 9, I think, where God says you can eat meat now. To Noah. So the world order changes all the time, and that's not a bad thing. We're not going backwards to Eden. We're going forward to the kingdom of heaven. And if God, if we break something, God has the opportunity to fix it and show more glory even in that. So that's essentially fall theology. I think that's, yeah. that's what I got about Genesis. There's probably more there. Complementarity is such a huge insidious thing. It's really hard to get into. Read James Bronson's book if you want more on that. We're going to move on into, I think we'll get to Revelation, and then I'll talk about more anything that I haven't hit on so far, and then we'll talk about like disembodied, like existential queer theology. But yeah, hope you enjoyed that one. You're doing great so far. I love you.